Once upon a long-forgotten twilight, nearly 4,000 years ago, the winds of the Aegean carried the scent of smoke, wet earth, and something darker, the sharp, metallic tang of blood. This was the world of 2000 BCE, a time when the old world turned slowly on cracked stone roads, and when violence was not just an occurrence but a rhythm of life. The Bronze Age had blossomed across the ancient world like a wild vine, twisting, glimmering, and dangerous. In the lands that would one day be called Greece, simple hilltop communities of the Middle Helladic period were discovering that sharp things, shiny things, could change everything. And so they did. In a village perched on a wind-blown ridge, nestled between olive trees and stubborn limestone, lived a man named Charon. Charon, like most men of his time, did not dream of peace. He dreamt of glory, of cattle, and of bronze. He had inherited a blade, dull with age but heavy with purpose. Forged in fire and cooled in blood, the bronze sword was a new kind of tool. Not for hunting, not for crafting. It was for humans, for dominance, for war. No one quite knew who first made war in this corner of the world. Maybe it began with a raid over stolen goats. Maybe a grudge over a shared well. Maybe it started, as many things do, with a woman taken against her will. But whatever the cause, the effect was this: blades drawn, spears lifted, shields raised. It was not war in the grand modern sense. No standing armies, no uniforms, no flags. Just Charon and a dozen other barefoot men in crude armor, hearts thundering behind leather and bone. They fought for resources, for honor, for their ancestors, or so they said. Really, they fought because they could. Bronze, that beautiful alloy of copper and tin, was the magic of their time. It sliced where stone chipped. It gleamed where wood dulled. And most of all, it whispered power. To wield bronze was to be elevated above your kin, to hold something sacred, almost godlike. Women, in the hearth-shadowed homes, told stories of heroes who carried bronze blades and never died. Children played at war, their sticks pretending to be gleaming swords. Elders remembered a time before metal, when disputes ended in shouting, not in blood. Charon remembered the first time he struck someone with his blade. A raider from the southern valley, thin and fast, had tried to take a sheep. Just one sheep. Charon's sword caught the man in the shoulder. The wound wasn't deep, but the look in the raider's eyes, that flash of surprise and pain, was burned into Charon's mind forever. That day, he learned that bronze gave one man the power to end another. The rise of stabbing, slicing, and slashing was not due only to malice. It was necessity. With growing populations came competition. Fields needed protection. Women and children needed defending. Raids were frequent, often seasonal. Like wolves, men came in winter. Villages built walls of stacked stone and dug ditches in the earth. Watchmen stood under moonlight, listening for the crunch of foreign feet. And blacksmiths, gods in their own right, hammered out destiny on anvil and flame. Each sword they forged was a promise. Your son may live, or he may die more swiftly. Across the sea, the Minoans were thriving in palaces of light and art. But the mainlanders, the Helladic peoples, were scrappier. Their pottery was plainer, their stories grimmer. And their weapons, those were better. For the Minoans celebrated life. The Helladic Greeks prepared for death. In time, warriors like Charon became respected or feared. They rose to leadership, not through vote or virtue, but through victory. The best warrior was the chief, the one who lived through the most winters, carried the deepest scars, and left the most men behind him in the dust. But war leaves its own wounds on the land. Graves began to fill, not with nameless poor, but with men buried with their swords. Shaft graves, they came to be called. Deep, circular pits carved into the earth, lined with stone, packed with offerings. Here lay the warrior chiefs, wrapped in linen, surrounded by gold, silver, and the weapon that had made them. Their stories were carved not in words but in silence. Bones broken in battle, skulls cleaved by bronze, ankles twisted from long marches. These were the epics of the Middle Helladic Age. Charon, too, met his end. No great war, no grand battle, A skirmish by the riverbank over grazing rights. He fell quickly, but his sword was buried with him, in a shaft grave lined with ash wood and bitter herbs. His sons told tales of his courage. His enemies forgot his name. So why was everyone getting stabbed with bronze swords in 2000 BCE? Because they could. Because they had to. Because bronze was power, and power was never shared freely. But there is another reason, softer and sadder, because they were human. And humans, when handed a blade and a reason, often choose the blade. Yet in that dark, ancient world, life went on. Babies were born beside the smoldering ruins of homes. Songs were sung in the wake of violence. And under olive trees, old women whispered prayers to forgotten gods, hoping their sons would live to see the spring. But history, like sleep, is never truly still. Karen's village did not fade with him. His sons carried his memory like a banner, and his grandson, little the Los, grew up in the flickering shadow of that sword. But the Los was different. He watched the smiths at work with curiosity, not hunger. He listened to the tales of war with unease. And on the nights when the old women sang their lullabies under the stars, he asked questions no one wanted to answer. Must it always be the sword? They told him yes, of course. It had always been. It always would be. But the Los dreamed of other things. He dreamed of trade, of journeys to distant shores, of sails billowing above blue waves. He bartered for stories with wandering traders. He learned their words. He saw their goods, polished ivory, amber beads, scarlet cloth, and wondered if a world built on gifts could outlast one built on wounds. One spring, when the winds turned warm and the rains gave way to sun, the Los took the bronze sword from his grandfather's grave. Not to wield it, not to fight, but to melt it down. In secret at night, with the help of an old smith tired of sharpening tools for murder, the Los fed the blade to fire. The hilt hissed, the edge curled, it wept itself into liquid, and from it they made a plowshare, a humble tool, meant not for war, but for earth, for seed, for harvest. The elders cursed him, the warriors mocked him, but others watched, and when the plowshare carved its first furrow into untouched soil, they followed. And so it was that Karen's sword, born in battle, buried in blood, was reborn in peace. No, it did not end the violence. Not entirely, but it proved that even in a world ruled by bronze and fear, someone, anyone, could choose a gentler path. So if you are still awake, let your last thoughts drift to that silent field, where bronze met soil and the past began to turn, ever so slightly, toward a better tomorrow. And dream of quiet revolutions. But the world does not rest for long, not even in dreams. Years passed, and the Los became a man of some repute. He was not a warrior, but he was respected. Not for his wounds, but for his wisdom. His village changed, not all at once, but slowly, like soil turned one season at a time. The plowshare he forged became the first of many. Some men took up farming instead of raiding. Others found work shaping wood, trading furs, fishing the rivers. Life found not all hearts beat for peace. Beyond the hills, other tribes heard whispers of Thalos's village. They heard of soft men who laid down their swords, and they laughed. Then they grew angry, for what is a world where the sword does not rule? It is a world that threatens the very bones of old power. So came Argon of the South, a war chief with fire in his beard and murder in his eyes. He gathered warriors, rough men who had never known the plow. They painted their shields with the blood of goats and stormed through the valleys with one thought, to remind the world what bronze was for. They came at dusk, as the last light bent through the trees. The Los was in the field, hands covered in earth. He heard the horns before he saw the torches. His heart did not race. He had always known this day might come. He ran not to hide but to lead. He gathered the villagers, pointed to the old storehouses, the hidden paths. Women and children fled into the hills. The men, untrained in war, stood behind stone walls with farming tools and shaking hands. Argon's warriors breached the outer gate with ease. They roared as they entered, swords high, shields gleaming. But what they found was not a village of cowards. It was a village of people who had chosen peace and would fight to preserve it. The Los did not carry a sword, but he carried resolve. He spoke not of gods or vengeance, but of legacy. "We are not warriors," he said to his neighbors, "but we are not prey. We stand not to destroy, but to protect." The battle was uneven. The villagers were outmatched, but something strange happened. The warriors hesitated. They had expected easy slaughter. They had not expected resistance. They had not expected courage without rage. In the chaos, a single blow struck Argon, not from a blade, but from a wooden staff swung by an old woman whose son had died in an earlier raid. The staff broke. Argon fell. The silence that followed was heavier than any death rattle. His men looked to one another. They were men of war, not of conviction. With their leader gone, their fire dimmed. One by one they stepped back, then turned, then ran. The village was spared. The wounded were tended to. The dead were buried with tears and song. And the Los, still unarmed, wept not for victory, but for what it had cost. Yet he also saw what it had earned. A chance. A moment in history where a plowshare had not only grown wheat, but hope. Word of the battle spread. Far-off villages sent messengers to learn from the Los, to trade seeds instead of weapons, to build ditches not to trap men, but to water fields. And though war never vanished from the world, something had shifted. The idea of peace became imaginable, not for all, but for some. Generations passed. The bronze swords rusted in forgotten graves. The fields grew wider, the roads more traveled. From the hills of the Aegean to the sunlit shores of Asia Minor, people began to tell the story, not of Charon the warrior, but of the Los the planter. And in one village, beneath the olive tree where the Los once sat watching the sky, a child asked their grandmother, "What is a sword?" The grandmother smiled. "A tool of the old world," she said, "before we learned to dream while awake." History is full of war, but it is also full of wonder. In the quiet folds of time, in the forgotten names and unmarked graves, there live men and women who changed the world not with force, but with faith. Faith in the soil, faith in the sun, faith in each other, and somewhere, deep in the earth, the last breath of a melted sword still lingers, warmed by fire, shaped by hands, softened by hope. The years unfurled like papyrus scrolls, lined with ink and breath and time. After the story of the Los spread, something rare began to ripple through the valleys and coastlines. Not peace, not yet, but the idea of peace. That was new, a precious thing, like fire stolen from the gods. In the northern hills, a chieftain named Meru heard of the Los. He had 3 sons and 30 warriors, and he had known nothing but raids and revenge. His people had grown thin from famine and fear. Crops burned in other men's fields fed no one. And though his arm was strong, his heart was tired. So Meru traveled with his sons to find the village of the planter. He arrived not with weapons, but with an offering, a copper sickle and a sheep. He bowed his head to the earth and said, "Teach me to grow. My sword has fed no one." The Los, now an old man with a back bent by both toil and time, took his hand. No words were needed. The villagers shared what they had. They showed Meru's sons the way of the soil, the pulse of the seasons, the magic of seed to sprout to sheaf. In time, Meru built a new village beside the river, a place without walls, where spears were tools for planting, not piercing. Farther east, in a dry, cracked plain where water hid beneath layers of stubborn rock, a girl named Isha learned the story of the Los. Her people laughed when she said she would build terraces and dig a canal. "Leave that to the gods," they said. But she believed that the gods had already given them hands, and that was blessing enough. Years of digging, stone by stone, calloused her palms and curved her spine. But water came, first a trickle, then a stream, then a song. Her village no longer wandered for food. They sang her name like a prayer. And when traders passed through, they told her tale alongside that of the Los. as if the two were echoes of one dream. And what of the bronze? The metal that once whispered only of death? Changed too. Slowly, silently, artisans learned to melt it not into blades but into bells, into bowls, into statues of horned gods and winged lions, tools for sewing, vessels for oil, mirrors for starlight. It still had its place in war, but now it had another life, a dual soul. The same hands that forged spears began to forge lyres. There was a boy named Errol who lived beside the sea. He was the son of a shipwright, and he had watched men leave for war and never return. One day, Errol found a broken sword buried in the sand. He brought it to the village elder, who nodded gravely. "We do not throw away such things," the elder said. "We reshape them." So they did. Together, they melted the blade and cast it into a harp. When Errol plucked its strings, it wept the song of the ocean, the sound of longing and return. Sailors from distant islands came to hear him play, and many laid down their swords just to stay a night longer. One night, under a waxing moon, a former mercenary named Hara sat beside Errol. She had crossed deserts and mountains, led armies and seen cities burn. She listened in silence, her hand on the scar that traced her cheek like a map of old grief. "This is the first time I have felt home," she whispered. Errol did not answer. He only played, and so it went, like roots under the earth, unseen but growing. The spirit of a gentler world crept forward, crept into stories and lullabies, into village councils and trade agreements, into the hearts of those who had lost more than they could name. But peace, like all things, was not perfect. There were still lords of blood and fire, still cities that grew fat on conquest. In the west, a great king rose who wore 10 rings of bronze and carried a sword taller than a child. He declared himself the shadow of the sun and marched on any who refused his banner. The warlord laughed. His armies then die standing. But before he could give the order, a strange thing happened. His own men hesitated, for they had heard the songs. They had walked through villages with full granaries and open hands. They had eaten bread from fields once barren. And many had children now, children who sang the name Delos like it was a spell. One soldier laid down his sword, then another, then 100. The warlord screamed, but it was no use. His power had leaked away, one kindled conscience at a time. He vanished into history, nameless in the end. But Lyra's words endured, not on tablets of clay, not carved in stone, but in breath, in tradition, in soil turned year after year by hands that knew there was another way. By the time iron came to the world, people still fought, but some remembered. Some still passed down the tales. And when bronze swords were unearthed centuries later, scholars would marvel. A warrior's age, they'd say. But somewhere, an old shepherd would smile and whisper, not just warriors, dreamers too. And maybe, in the wind, the strings of Errol's harp would echo once more. The age of bronze was not only an age of stabbing and steel. It was an age of becoming, of fire forged into more than fury, of people who dared to plant, to sing, to mend. So close your eyes. Let the swords rust. Let the plows gleam. Let history breathe softly in your dreams. And when you wake, perhaps build something gentler. For that too is history, and so are you. But the world, as ever, turned. The rivers flowed, carrying silt and secrets, while hills rose and crumbled under the weight of time. As the songs of the Los and Errol lingered in the air, a generation was born who knew peace not as legend, but as lived truth. They did not understand the ache of sword arms or the reek of burning cities, but they knew stories. They knew lullabies whispered over firelight, and dreams painted on cave walls with ochre and soot. One such child was Nomi, daughter of Lyra, a girl with a voice that mirrored wind in reeds and eyes that carried the golden hush of dusk. She wandered often, alone but never lost, speaking to birds and tracing stars with her fingers. Elders said she was marked by the gods, but Nomi would smile and say, "No gods, just the earth, and she speaks if you listen." Nomi did not seek greatness, but greatness, like a shadow at dawn, sought her. One spring, a drought choked the valley. Crops shriveled, rivers retreated, and whispers of hunger slithered into the huts. The village council gathered, afraid. The oldest among them recalled the dry years of the past, years that ended in raids, in hoarding, in the clangor of sharpened bronze. But Nomi stood and said, "Let us walk. Let us find those who have water, and share what little we carry." Her words were soft, but they rippled outward. She led a caravan of women and children, bearing grain, cloth, and music. They walked for 7 days until they reached the mountain people, who watched with narrowed eyes and guarded hearts. Nomi sang, not with power, but with presence, a song of old harvests and future rains, of rivers that remembered kindness. And the mountain people listened. They shared their hidden wells, their terraced fields that caught the morning mist. The caravan returned not with plunder, but with promise. The valley bloomed again, not just with food, but with a new kind of knowing. That hope, too, could be exchanged. In the coastal city of Caliph, where bronze still glittered in armories and soldiers patrolled the citadel walls, a quiet rebellion began, not of swords, but of sculpture. A guild of artisans, led by a man named Daryl, began crafting statues not of warriors or kings, but of farmers, of midwives, of singers. These statues spread like wind-blown seeds to plazas and market squares, and slowly, the people who passed them began to see themselves reflected in them. One statue, carved of soft stone, showed a father teaching his child to weave a basket. Another depicted 2 women planting together, foreheads touching. These were not tales of conquest, but of connection. And in Caliph, the very definition of hero began to change. Elsewhere, beneath the shifting sands of the southern dunes, a tribe known as the Seli had once lived only by the blade. Their warriors were feared across a dozen valleys. But the youngest chieftain, a quiet man named Eller, had a vision while tending a wounded hawk. He saw his people dancing in peace, their blades melted and reborn as wind chimes. Eller stopped leading raids. He trained his warriors not in ambush, but in healing. They became wanderers who carried salves and songs. Villages that once barred their gates now offered bread. The Seli became something new, not feared, but followed. Their old enemies became allies. And Eller's vision, once called foolish, was etched into stone at the edge of the Great Salt Flats. Let your hands be brave in planting. Let your feet be swift in peace. Years passed, decades blurred. The world changed again. New metals, new kings, new gods. But beneath the layers of conquest and architecture, under the marble statues and iron forts, the old stories lingered. A child in the hills of Mycenae whispered the name Delos into the wind. A potter in the Levant carved the symbol of Errol's harp onto the bottom of a bowl. A grandmother in Anatolia traced the tale of Lyra in the dirt for her grandchildren, as the sun set and the goats returned. Bronze swords, once the mark of dominion, became museum pieces, rusted, revered, but mute. Yet in villages that no map remembered, bronze bells still rang at harvest. Lyres still wept beneath olive trees. Peace still found form, in bread shared, in fields sown, in lullabies passed hand to hand like heirlooms. And Nomi, who had grown old, sat beneath the same tree where the Los once dreamed. Children gathered around her, begging for stories. "Tell us the one about the harp," they'd say. Or, "The girl who built canals." Or, "The soldiers who walked away." And Nomi would smile, her eyes glassy with memory. "I will tell you a story," she'd say. "But remember, it is not only about them. It is about you, because you are the end of their song, and maybe it's beginning again." The children would listen, breathless, and above them the stars would keep watch. And below, in the soil, something would stir, soft, quiet, enduring, because the age of stabbing may have passed, but the age of becoming never ends. Nomi's stories drifted far beyond her village. Traders carried her name along river routes. Sailors sang of her kindness as they tied knots under moonlight. Her voice, recorded on clay tablets by scribes who believed in more than just kings, became a quiet scripture, copied and passed between hands like sacred seeds. Generations passed, and with them the certainty of facts faded, but the feelings remained. Nomi became not just a woman, but a symbol, a whisper in lullabies, a line in a love song, a reason, some said, to believe in something gentler than war. In a city rising from the dust where old Akkadian roads met newer Mycenaean paths, a temple was built, not to a god of thunder or conquest, but to memory. Its walls bore no gold, its altars no flame, only a single bronze harp hung from the ceiling, its strings made of woven rivergrass, renewed each year by children. Here, pilgrims came not to beg for miracles, but to listen. Old women shared songs. Young men recited tales of peace. Travelers left carvings of their hands on the outer wall. One such traveler was a scribe named Malin, who came from a storm-ridden isle far to the west. Malin walked for months, guided not by map but by stories, by fragments overheard in markets, by murals glimpsed on tavern walls. He came with a single question scratched onto bark. Can peace endure? He sat beneath the harp, closed his eyes and listened, not to sound, but to silence. And in that silence he wrote, yes, when it is sung. He took that answer back to his island. There, amidst the stone and sea, he taught children not to raise shields, but to craft sails, not to march but to map. And the island, once fractured by clan feuds, became a sanctuary for song. In the far north, in lands of mist and pine, a new conflict brewed. A rising warlord named Dirun claimed descent from the sun and demanded all tribes kneel. His banners bore bronze spears, and his words scorched the snow. But a girl named Erla stood against him, not with blade, but with story. She told of Nomi and the Los, of Eller and the melted swords. She painted their stories in ochre across the ice caves, and the children of Dirun's warriors crept in at night to read them. And one by one they began to ask their fathers, why do we fight? And silence again began to answer. In a market town by the reeds, a young boy named Joran uncovered an old blade buried in the silt. Its bronze glinted faintly in the light. Around it were bones, many bones. His grandmother told him, that was from the days of stabbing. He nodded solemnly, then melted the blade into a bell. That bell, hung in the center of the square, rang each morning, not to summon soldiers, but to announce the opening of the bakery, the start of the songs, the hour for play. And so, the great tide of blood that once drenched the Bronze Age ebbed. Not all at once. There were still battles, still kings who dreamed of empire. But beneath it all, a quieter history pulsed. In schools carved into cliffs, children learned not only of dates and dynasties, but of the unnamed girl who sang to the mountains. In gardens grown over forgotten forts, old men knelt in silence and gave thanks for the peace their fathers never knew. And far away, in a cave where Errol once played his final song, a wind passed through the hollow lyre and made music again. It was not grand, it was not loud, but it was enough. And somewhere, perhaps under the stars or beside a sleepy hearth, someone just like you was listening and dreaming. For what is history if not a lullaby? A way to remember, not just what was lost, but what might be found. A cradle for the soul. So let it rock you gently now. Close your eyes. Let the Los and Nomi and all the unnamed dreamers keep watch. The swords are gone. The stories remain. Sleep, child of time. Tomorrow waits, and it waits in peace.